No food for Christmas dinner. The widow's neighbor brought an Apache woman and her child. The snow had been falling for days, turning the little frontier town into a cold, silent world. Mary, the widow, stood by the window of her small cabin, looking out at the white landscape. The wind howled through the trees, and the flakes danced in the air like tiny bits of dust. It was Christmas Eve, and Mary had been hoping for a better day, but the reality of the past few months weighed heavily on her heart. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away last spring, leaving her alone to run the farm. The harvest had been poor that year, and the animals had barely survived the harsh winter. Mary had worked hard, but there was only so much one person could do. The crops had withered in the dry soil, and the few animals she had left were weak. The town had been struggling too, with many families losing their livelihoods. People spoke in whispers, worried about the coming months, but no one had enough to share. Mary had planned for a simple Christmas. She had saved a little flour and salt from her meager supplies, hoping to make a small meal. It wouldn't be much, but at least it would be something. She had always loved Christmas, the warmth, the stories, and the spirit of togetherness. She had hoped, just for one night, that things might feel a little brighter. But with no food to spare, the thought of a Christmas dinner felt impossible. She set the table anyway, laying out a single plate for herself. The small wooden table looked empty, and the room felt colder than it should. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but it couldn't chase away the deep sense of loss that lingered in the air. The door opened suddenly, and Mary turned, startled. Standing in the doorway was Jacob Tanner, her neighbor. He looked tired, his face drawn with the weight of his own troubles. Behind him, though, was something that made Mary's heart skip a beat. A woman, an Apache woman, holding a small child in her arms. Jacob stepped inside, brushing the snow off his coat. Mary, I didn't know what else to do, he said, his voice rough. This is Ayana and her son, Hakan. They've been traveling for days. They have nowhere else to go. Mary blinked, unsure of what to say. She had heard stories of Native Americans who had been pushed off their land, forced to wander. The thought of an Apache woman in her cabin made her uneasy. She had never met an Apache before, and the town had always been quiet about their people, though she knew of the tensions that existed between settlers and Native Americans. It wasn't that she hated them, far from it, but the unknown made her anxious. Ayana stepped into the cabin slowly, her dark eyes scanning the room. She was dressed in simple clothes, worn from travel, but her presence was calm, almost graceful. She looked exhausted, her hair matted by the snow, her skin pale but firm. Her son, Hakan, was wrapped in a blanket, clinging to his mother's side. He was no more than 4 or 5 years old, his face curious, but his small hands clutched his mother tightly, as if he feared the world around him. Jacob stepped forward, gesturing to the fire. It's cold out there. You must be freezing. Let's get you warm. Mary didn't move at first. She had no food to offer, no real welcome to give. The dinner she had planned for herself was barely enough, and now here was a family who would need more than just warmth. She had nothing left to share. Ayana, noticing Mary's hesitation, spoke softly. I understand if you're not comfortable with us, but we've been on the road for days, and we have nowhere else. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to offer kindness, but she felt the weight of the situation too much. I'm not sure I have enough to feed all of us, she finally said, her voice quiet. Jacob looked at her with understanding. We'll make do, he said, his voice gentle. I couldn't leave them out there, not in this weather. Mary nodded slowly, stepping aside so they could enter. The warmth from the fire hit her like a wave, and she watched as Ayana sat down beside it, still holding her son. Hakan looked up at her with wide eyes, his small face pale but curious. We've got a little food, Mary said softly, her hands trembling as she straightened the table. Not much, but it's something. If you don't mind, you're welcome to join me. Ayana nodded, her face softening with a faint smile. Thank you. We are grateful. The child Hakan seemed to relax a little, though he still kept close to his mother. Mary took a deep breath, trying to push away the feelings of doubt and worry. It wasn't much, but at least she wasn't alone, and she wasn't the only one facing hardship. Jacob sat down, pulling his coat off, and Ayana followed suit. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. The cabin seemed warmer now, filled with the quiet presence of others. Despite the smallness of the room and the emptiness of the table, there was something comforting about having people nearby. The loneliness that had weighed so heavily on Mary's heart seemed a little lighter now. She sat down at the table, looking at the small amount of food she had. There wasn't much Just some dried beans, a small hunk of bread, and a little bit of salted meat, but she'd make it work. They all would. Jacob looked over at her. I know it's not much, but I'm thankful. It's better than I expected when I came here. Mary smiled softly, though it didn't reach her eyes. It's all I have, but you're welcome to share it. She felt a warmth in her chest, something that had been missing for too long. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was enough. Ayanna smiled at her, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. We have little too, but it's enough. We share what we can. The room was silent for a moment as they all began to eat. Mary glanced at Ayanna, noticing how she carefully fed her son first before eating herself. The woman had an air of quiet strength about her, something Mary admired despite her own unease. The child, Hakan, was shy, but he looked up at Mary with curiosity in his eyes. She smiled at him, and he returned it hesitantly. Mary sat back, watching the flickering shadows of the fire dance on the walls. The cabin felt warmer now, not just from the fire, but from the presence of others. She couldn't help but wonder if this was what Christmas truly meant. Not the food, the gifts, or the decorations, but the kindness shared between strangers, and the strength they found in each other. As the night stretched on, the storm outside grew fiercer, but inside the cabin there was a quiet peace. And for the first time in months, Mary felt that perhaps this Christmas wouldn't be so lonely after all. As the evening wore on, the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling through the trees like a wild animal. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, its warmth spreading across the room. Mary, Ayanna, Jacob, and little Hakan sat quietly, eating what little food was left. The meal was humble, but the warmth and quiet conversation made it feel like much more. Ayanna had shared stories of her travels. She spoke softly of her people, the Apache, and how their land had been taken from them over the years. It was a tale that seemed familiar, a story of loss and survival. Mary listened, feeling a deep sorrow for the woman sitting beside her. Ayanna's eyes were filled with the kind of strength that only comes from enduring hardships no one should have to face. I come from the mountains, Ayanna explained. My people lived there, hunted the deer, and gathered the plants, but the white soldiers came and pushed us out. We had to leave our homes, our land. We walked for days and days with nothing. No food, no shelter. She couldn't imagine the kind of pain that Ayanna had experienced. That's terrible, Mary said, her voice soft. I'm sorry. Ayanna nodded, but there was no bitterness in her words, just a quiet acceptance. There's nothing to be sorry for. It's what happens when people fight for what they want. But we survive. We always survive. Mary admired her strength, though she couldn't help but wonder what would happen to Ayanna and her son. Where would they go after this? What would become of them? The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. Hakan, who had been quiet since entering the cabin, looked up at Mary. His big brown eyes were filled with curiosity, and Mary found herself smiling at the child. He was so small, so innocent. She could tell that he didn't fully understand the hardships his mother had gone through, but in his gaze there was something wise beyond his years. Mary gave him a gentle smile, hoping to make him feel welcome. Do you like the fire, Hakan? He nodded shyly, his small fingers wrapped tightly around the blanket his mother had given him. Yes, he whispered. That's good, Mary said softly. It's a good fire to keep us warm. The room felt more comfortable now, the weight of the silence broken by the soft murmurs of the small group. Jacob had been quiet for a while, staring into the fire, his face filled with thought. Mary, Jacob spoke after a long pause, his voice low. I didn't want to leave Ayanna and her son out there, but I didn't know how you'd react. I know it's hard, having someone new in your home, especially someone from a different world. Mary looked at Jacob, her heart heavy. She had never expected her Christmas Eve to take such a turn, but there was something about Ayanna's presence that brought a strange comfort. I was surprised, that's all, she admitted. But I'm glad you brought them here. They have nowhere else to go. Jacob nodded, his eyes meeting Mary's with a quiet understanding. I know. I couldn't turn them away. The storm's only getting worse, and I don't know what would have happened to them out there. Ayanna looked up at them both, her face peaceful but worn with the weight of her journey. Thank you, she said softly, for letting us stay. Mary smiled warmly, though she could see the exhaustion in Ayanna's eyes. It had been a long road for them, and Mary couldn't help but think that maybe they had been brought together for a reason. After all, it was Christmas Eve, a time for kindness and sharing, a time to be reminded of the things that truly mattered. Just as the fire seemed to settle into a soft glow, a loud knock echoed from the door. Everyone in the cabin froze, their eyes wide with surprise. It was a strange sound, especially with the storm outside, but the knock was clear and urgent. Who's that? Jacob stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle hanging on the wall. Mary felt her heart race, her mind racing for an explanation. Could it be more travelers? A band of raiders? The thought made her uneasy, but she couldn't imagine anyone else being out in the storm. She glanced at Ayanna, whose face showed no fear, only quiet strength. "I'll check," Jacob said, heading toward the door. He glanced back at Mary before he opened it, his face wary. "Stay here." The door creaked open, and Mary could hear Jacob speaking in low tones to someone outside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she anxiously waited for the conversation to end. A few moments later, Jacob stepped back into the cabin, his face a mixture of surprise and confusion. Behind him stood two more men, both rugged and weathered from the storm. Their faces were grim, their eyes scanning the cabin with suspicion. One of the men, a tall man with dark hair and a thick beard, stepped forward. "Evening," he said gruffly, tipping his hat to Mary. "Name's Bill. This here's Pete. We're just passing through looking for shelter. Saw the smoke from the chimney." Mary's eyes widened. More strangers in the dead of winter. But before she could say anything, Jacob stepped forward. "Bill, Pete, this is Mary, the widow I told you about," Jacob said quickly. "This is her cabin. We're sharing Christmas Eve together." Bill's eyes flicked to Ayanna, who was sitting quietly by the fire with her son, her presence calm and steady. He narrowed his eyes for a brief moment but said nothing. His companion, Pete, stood at the door, keeping his distance. "We're not looking for trouble," Bill added. "Just shelter for the night. We'll move on at first light." Mary felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. These men, though they seemed harmless enough, were strangers. And there was something unsettling about their cold eyes, as though they weren't used to sharing with others. "Of course," Mary said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're welcome to stay for the night, but we don't have much to offer." Ayanna turned her head slightly toward the men, her eyes calm. "We have little, but we'll share what we can," she said softly. Bill and Pete exchanged looks, as if surprised by her words. They hesitated for a moment before stepping into the cabin. The storm outside howled even louder, and Mary could feel the cold creeping through the walls. As the men settled near the fire, Mary couldn't help but wonder about the future. The night had brought strangers, but it had also brought an unexpected sense of unity. It was Christmas Eve, and despite the challenges, there was a feeling of warmth in the cabin. Warmth that came not from the fire, but from the kindness shared between these unlikely companions. And in that moment, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. The storm outside howled louder as the hours passed. Snow piled up outside the cabin, and the wind whipped through the trees, causing the small structure to creak and groan. Inside, the warmth from the fire kept the cold at bay, but the quiet tension between the people in the room remained. There were more strangers now, Bill and Pete, two men who had wandered in from the storm seeking shelter for the night. They had sat by the fire, keeping to themselves, but it was clear they were wary, not just of the storm, but of the unfamiliar faces in the cabin. Ayanna sat near the fire with her son, Hakan, her posture calm but alert. The little boy clung to his mother, his eyes wide with curiosity, though he remained silent. Mary had done her best to make them all feel welcome, but the strange mix of people in the room weighed heavily on her heart. Bill and Pete, though they appeared harmless enough, were men of the wilderness, used to surviving on their own. They didn't share much, and their eyes often flicked to Ayanna and her child with an air of distrust. It was clear that, like Mary, they weren't entirely sure how to feel about the Apache woman and her son. Jacob, who had known these men for years, seemed to sense the unspoken tension. He stood by the fire, his hands resting on his hips, his brow furrowed. He hadn't expected the night to unfold this way. Ayanna's arrival, the storm, and now two more strangers, but he wasn't about to let things fall apart. "Why don't we all just sit down and share what we can?" Jacob said, breaking the silence. "It's Christmas Eve. There's no need to be suspicious of each other. We're all just trying to make it through this storm." Bill, the taller of the two men, grunted. "I'm not suspicious, just cautious." He glanced at Ayanna again, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what it is about a woman from that tribe being here, but if she's not causing trouble, I guess we'll let her stay." Mary noticed Ayanna's eyes narrow slightly at Bill's words, but she remained quiet. Her gaze didn't leave the fire, and she seemed to have a calm about her that Mary admired. It was as if she had faced far worse than a few skeptical settlers and had learned not to react to everything that was said or done around her. "It's cold outside," Pete added, his voice gruff but softer than Bill's. "We've got no place else to go. We appreciate the shelter."
Mary nodded, her voice gentle.
"Of course. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to. We don't have much, but we have enough for one night. She gave a small smile, trying to ease the tension in the room. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling and the quiet shuffling of people moving around. Ayana began to unwrap a bundle of fur and cloth from around Hakan, gently placing the child down on a blanket beside her. He yawned, his small face showing signs of exhaustion, and Ayana stroked his hair with a tenderness that spoke volumes about her love for him. Mary watched the scene quietly. Despite the coldness of the night and the wariness between them all, there was a sense of peace between Ayana and her child. It was a bond that Mary recognized, one that was unspoken but deeply felt. It made her think of her own late husband, Thomas, and the way he had always tried to protect her, even in the harshest of times. Bill cleared his throat, disrupting Mary's thoughts. You know, we're not used to having company like this, but I've seen worse. Out there on the trail, you don't have much to trust but the land beneath your feet. Folks who've been through hard times stick together, even when it's tough. His voice softened as he spoke, and Mary saw a flicker of something behind his eyes, a realization, perhaps, that they were all more alike than he had thought. Pete shifted in his seat, casting a sidelong glance at Ayana. I've heard stories, he muttered, almost to himself, about the Apache. But a lot of them are just stories. I don't know what's true and what's not. Ayana's calm voice broke the silence. Some stories are true, she said softly, her gaze never leaving Pete. But some are only told to make people afraid. Mary looked at Ayana, impressed by how she spoke with such quiet authority. There was no anger or bitterness in her words, just truth. Ayana's eyes met Mary's briefly, and Mary felt a deep respect for her. She had endured so much, and yet there was no trace of resentment in her voice. We are all just people, Ayana continued, her voice steady. We have our differences, yes, but we also have our struggles. And when you've lost everything, you learn that you have to trust those who offer kindness, even when you don't know them. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mary felt a shift within her, a deeper understanding of Ayana's experience. She had lost her land, her people, and yet here she was, sitting by a fire with strangers, sharing what little she had. The thought struck Mary deeply. Perhaps this Christmas there was more to be grateful for than she had first realized. Jacob cleared his throat, bringing everyone's attention back to the present. Ayana's right. We all have our struggles, and maybe it's time we stop looking at each other with suspicion and start looking for ways to help each other. Bill and Pete exchanged a look, and after a long moment, Bill gave a small nod. I suppose you're right, he muttered. We've all been through a lot this year. We'll share what we can. Mary smiled, the tension in her chest easing for the first time that evening. It was a small victory, but it was something. Slowly, one by one, the men began to relax. The fire crackled more softly now, and the wind outside seemed a little less harsh. Over the next hour they shared stories. Nothing grand, just bits of life from the frontier. Jacob told them about the rough winter, how the cattle had been struggling to find enough grazing. Pete spoke about his travels through the mountains, and Bill talked about the time he had spent hunting for furs in the north. Even Ayana shared a few stories of her people, of how they had once lived in peace with the land before it was taken from them. It was not the kind of Christmas Mary had imagined, but it was real. It was filled with people who had been broken and rebuilt in different ways, but who, in that moment, found common ground. The evening was simple, quiet, but somehow it felt like the true spirit of Christmas had found its way into the cabin after all. As the fire burned low, Jacob stood up, stretching. Well, it's getting late, he said. I'm sure we could all use some rest. Mary stood as well, gathering the empty plates. I'll set up a place for the two of you, she said, looking at Bill and Pete. The floor's not much, but it'll be warm. Bill and Pete nodded, and after a few moments they moved to a corner of the cabin where they could sleep. Ayana, still with Hakan nestled beside her, stood as well, and Mary couldn't help but notice the tiredness in her eyes. The day had been long and filled with uncertainty, but Ayana had remained steady through it all.
Thank you, Ayana said softly, meeting Mary's gaze.
For your kindness. It's nothing. We all need each other, don't we? As the cabin settled into a quiet calm, Mary felt the weight of the past few months lift slightly. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, Christmas wasn't about the food or the decorations. It was about the people who found their way into your life, even in the most unexpected of ways. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, there was peace. The snow had stopped falling by morning, leaving behind a quiet, still world outside. The wind had calmed, and the sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a soft glow on the cabin. The storm that had brought together unlikely companions had passed, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the sense of shared experience remained. Mary woke early, stretching her stiff arms as the morning light crept across the floor. The fire had burned low during the night, but there was still enough warmth to keep the chill at bay. She glanced over at the small group still gathered in the cabin. Bill and Pete had already risen and were sitting by the fire, their boots on, preparing to leave. Ayanna was sitting on her blanket, with little Hakon curled up beside her, both still asleep. Mary quietly stood and moved toward the small kitchen area. There was no food left to make a proper breakfast, but she could at least brew some tea. The kettle whistled softly as it heated, and Mary poured the hot water into cups, letting the steam fill the room with the scent of herbs. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture. She set the cups down in front of the men and then turned to Ayanna, who was still tending to Hakon. "Would you like some tea?" Mary asked gently, her voice quiet, as she didn't want to disturb the peace. Ayanna looked up, her eyes soft as she smiled and nodded. "Yes, thank you," she replied. As Mary handed her the cup, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The night had gone better than she had expected. Despite the tension that had initially existed between everyone, they had shared something real, something beyond their pasts or their differences. The simplicity of the moment, sitting together in the warmth, felt like the truest form of peace. Jacob, who had been standing by the door, stretched and turned toward the men. "We'll need to get moving soon. The storm has passed, but it's still a long way to town." Bill nodded and stood up, stretching his legs. "We'll be on our way, don't you worry." "Thanks for letting us stay the night." Mary looked up at Bill and Pete, her heart lighter than it had been the night before. Despite the uncertainty and awkwardness, the men had shown a different side to themselves by the end of the evening. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like something had shifted. They weren't strangers anymore. They were people who had shared a moment together, people who had offered what they could, no matter how small. "You're welcome," she said simply. "And take care of yourselves out there. The roads are still icy." Bill gave a small smile, and for a brief moment Mary saw a hint of kindness behind his usual rough exterior. "We will. You stay safe, too," he said, before turning toward the door. Pete followed Bill outside, and Mary stood in the doorway, watching them as they disappeared into the fresh snow. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't mind. She felt a deep sense of peace now that they were leaving. Not because they had been unwelcome, but because the night had brought something she hadn't expected: connection. When she turned back inside, she found Ayanna looking at her, her eyes full of something Mary couldn't quite place. "Thank you for sharing with us," Ayanna said softly, her voice gentle yet full of meaning. "You gave us warmth when we had none. Not just from the fire, but from your heart." Mary felt her throat tighten at the words. "It was nothing," she whispered, but deep down she knew it had been something. She had offered more than just shelter. She had offered understanding, and in return she had received it. "We will leave soon," Ayanna continued. "But I want you to know, if you ever need us, we will be here." Mary nodded slowly, touched by the sincerity in Ayanna's words. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Her hand resting gently on Hakon's head. "We will remember this night," she said. "The kindness you gave, it means more than you know." The room was filled with a peaceful silence as the last of the morning's light spread across the floor. Mary watched as Ayanna gathered her things, preparing to leave, and she felt a sense of finality. The night had been a turning point for all of them, a reminder that in times of hardship people could come together, even if they were from different worlds. As Ayanna stood, she carefully lifted Hakon into her arms. The child stirred but didn't fully wake, his small face soft and innocent in his mother's arms. Mary smiled at the pair of them, feeling a deep sense of connection. Despite the struggles that lay ahead for all of them, there was something unspoken between them now, something shared and lasting. Mary stepped forward, holding out a small bundle of food she had saved. It wasn't much, just a handful of dried fruit and a bit of bread, but it was all she had. "Please, take this," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's something." Ayanna hesitated for a moment, but then she accepted the food with a quiet nod. "Thank you." As Ayanna and Hakon moved toward the door, Mary stepped aside to let them pass. For the briefest moment, their eyes met again, and Mary felt something in her heart stir, a recognition of something deeper, something beyond their differences. They were all just people, trying to survive in a world that could be cold and unforgiving. I'll be okay," Mary said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. Still, she spoke the words because she wanted Ayanna to know. "I think we all will be." Ayanna smiled, and there was a warmth in her expression that made Mary feel as if, just maybe, things would be all right. "Yes," Ayanna said, her voice filled with hope. "We will be." As they stepped outside into the fresh snow, Mary watched them for a moment longer, her heart full of unexpected gratitude. She had started the night thinking she would be alone on Christmas Eve, but now she understood that loneliness didn't have to be permanent. It could be a passing thing, a shadow that lifted when people came together, no matter who they were or where they came from. Mary closed the door softly behind her and turned back to the empty cabin. The silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of solitude, but the quiet that comes after something important has passed, something that has changed things for the better. She stood there for a moment, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over her, and then she smiled to herself. It had been a Christmas to remember, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The storm had passed, but it had brought something much more lasting than the weather. It had brought the beginning of something new. And for the first time in a long while, Mary felt a flicker of hope.